There are, in this world, 10 great evils. These are unemployment, debt, poverty, inflation, pollution, waste, taxation, homelessness, war, and injustice. All of these evils are created by the state. They all represent unnecessary costs paid for by those who work and create wealth. The state is a parasite. However, it has a problem, a paradox really. Reality is created by God. This reality is logical and analytical and moral. No one can oppose it without becoming technically insane. This is especially true regarding the state. The state, rejecting God, produces the 10 great evils. The state promises much but has nothing to give and so commits itself to a life of crime. Conservatives will work at a trade. The people create value. The money they earn allows them to acquire goods and services produced by others. In a free market there is no need for government. It is the government who alone creates a need for the state. Conservatives need only a union or what the Bible calls a church. The state's primary function is defense, and a standing army costs money. The army defends the state from other armies belonging to other states. But even this explanation puts the cart before the horse, to some degree. The average person has no interest in invading another nation, or city, or in taking what some foreigner has when he has nothing that the regular person already has. This is true in ancient times. It takes a power-hungry ruler to see a benefit in invading another country. The ruler often does not pay the costs of war directly or personally and is the inheritor of most of the benefits. War is or was a way to accumulate power and wealth in a time when wealth was not that concentrated and land was, with its population, the main source of a leader's power. But wars in the modern world are highly destructive in a time when no modern people will permit large-scale killing, not even of enemy non-combatants. The most a war can hope to accomplish is to neutralize an aggressor or to gain raw materials, as most infrastructure will be destroyed during the conflict. But raw materials do not justify a war. Wars are too expensive and raw materials too easily obtained by other means to warrant engaging in a war of rapine. What is not often understood is that wars were not usually fought to enrich the ruler, though he was the one who usually benefited the most. It was also a way to enrich his most important supporters, his generals, and the ranks. A military that could wage successful wars and enrich the troops with booty was a military that remained loyal to their commander. Tariffs are a less bloody method of achieving the same ends. Imports are charged fees to make domestic goods cheaper and domestic businesses more successful. But these attempts to externalize the costs of government onto foreign populations are never successful in the long term. Britain and Rome both learned that. The government must raise money for its operations and ultimately it has to turn to the people. Which means that the people not only have to pay for their own benefits, they have to pay the costs of the government providing them. Thus, if one has government, one invariably has taxation, and when there is taxation there is inflation, and most likely, at some point, debt will enter into the picture. Inflation can be of two sorts. There is money inflation where money loses value due to increases in debt or the printing of money. There is also cost plus inflation caused by business seeking to remain profitable and labor seeking higher wages. Sometimes it is more of one than the other, but the only remedy possible to counter this is unemployment. There needs to be a pool of unemployed to keep the pressure on wages low. But if wages decline relative to profits and prices, there will be a greater reliance on consumer debt. But debt also occurs when the state wishes to wage a war or engage in a social agenda beyond what current receipts permit. But to justify the existence of the state, requires the state to exist, and this requires income from some source. If it cannot be obtained by war and rapine, then taxation is the only other option. But just as war requires force be inflicted on the alien population to separate them from what is theirs, so too does taxation require force of the threat of force to be applied to subjects to permit the extraction of wealth that rightfully belongs to them. To combat inflation and maintain stability as well as to permit the taxation required to fund government operations, some level of unemployment must be maintained. Unemployment keeps the worker passive to the point where military action is not required. It's a matter of degree. The worker faces the alternatives, of permitting the state to take a portion of what is theirs or imprisoning them and taking away their livelihood, so they lose everything. It's the classic protection racket. Pay me a portion of what you earn, and I will protect you from what I will do to you, if you do not comply. Poverty is the other tool of oppression. It follows unemployment, taxation, and debt. Of course, poverty has to be carefully controlled because if it becomes too prevalent, crime will increase and possibly, rebellion. If the poor and middle class can be separated, the poor have fewer reasons to rebel as there is no leverage in rioting in a slum. The main objective of the state is to keep the middle class in a state of apathetic compliance. But the unemployed and destitute are a waste of resources. They consume but do not produce. At best they are a large buffer zone between the state and the worker. Where we have poverty and unemployment there is waste, homelessness and injustice. But the state is in no position to eliminate these things. It is the primary source of all social costs. Its social agenda is simply an attempt to reduce the impact it has on the economy by doing what it has always done but in a different way. Instead of pandering solely to the wealthy, for example, it begins to shift more resources to some other minority. It justifies this by giving this minority an aura of victimhood. The state with its social agenda becomes the hero, using the resources of a suspect group to redress the grievance of a victim group. What is not addressed is the state's role in creating the underlying problem. The bottom line is that there is a group that produces value. This group does not need the state. If this group created value and exchanged the products of their labor, there would be no unemployment, injustice, war, or even crime. But there is another group that does not create value or creates insufficient value to compensate for the costs they represent. This creates issues. One might be tempted to claim that the first group saw a need for the state to deal with the rogue group. But that is not what is observed. What happens is that the rogue group is dealt with by the value group until the rogue group creates gangs and the gangs form into the state. It is only as the state that parasites have the power and organization needed to overcome the resistance of the high value group. The fact remains that only parasites need the state and only parasites support the state. Even if in other respects one works and earns their way, if you are an advocate for state power you desire to leverage what you have into something more than you have earned. That both rich and poor think the state is able to bless them with more than they deserve pays tribute to the manipulative abilities of the state. But virtually everyone thinks they are at risk from someone, and so think they need the state. But all 10 evils are the direct consequence of the state. Part of the reason for this misunderstanding about risk is because the state is often contrasted with anarchy, and anarchy is connected with chaos. Eliminating the state would seem to usher in panic and chaos. This is true because this system is designed to operate with the state. The system makes the state necessary. The state needs parasites to justify its social agenda and so creates parasites. As was pointed out, without parasites the state would not be needed. So, the state seeks to create as many special interest groups with special needs, as is possible, to give it legitimacy. The last thing the state needs is a person who has no wish to receive anything from the state. We fear the demise of the state because we fear others. We think the state puts a bottom line under what could happen to us. The state appears to give us a degree of security from others, but it is the state that represents the greatest risk. We think the state operates within the law, but it originates the law. We fear others who create their own law but think the law created by the state is not a threat to us. Yet, the state is a parasite and favors other parasites over the gainfully employed. What will the parasites do, when and if the state is done away with? The 10 great evils of unemployment, debt, poverty, inflation, pollution, waste, taxation, homelessness, war, and injustice are all products of the state. They are created by the state as it nurtures parasitism. Unemployment exists as a way to keep labor passive when faced with the parasitic rich. We accept private ownership of the means of production, even though it produces unemployment, because otherwise we would not have a job. Debt is a cost of currency being owned. Inflation is the result of too many people chasing after goods they have no right to, not having produced an equal amount of their own. And so on. All of the 10 great evils are produced by the actions of government empowering people who do not produce things of value. But Christians are by nature ungovernable, and so they wish to replace us with groups that are more submissive to authority. This is the ultimate injustice. The civilized world is ours because we created it. The value was produced by us, and we own it. But we are being forcibly divested. The parasites wish to take over. Civilization belongs to the West, we created it. If not every element of it, we brought it together and assembled it into something like a cohesive whole. Civilization requires a free, unencumbered people. The state is not interested in civilization, it wants power. The governments of the West want to replace the peoples of the Western nations. Globalism is the desire for a one-world government that owns and controls everything, in a world peopled by a population which is not Christian or white. The 10 great evils are intrinsic to globalism. In a real sense, these evils are manufactured by the activities that lead to a one-world government. The 10 great evils produce an ever-increasing concentration of wealth, along with an ever more subservient population. To reverse the process, conservatives must separate in keeping with the Bible. To do this, we have to defeat the 10 great evils and the parasitism that gives rise to them. The process of separation and the process of eliminating the 10 great evils are the same. We must cease taking anything that does not belong to us, and we must also stop others from taking from us what we have earned. This requires a new accounting. To eliminate parasitism is to eliminate liabilities. All property has one legitimate owner, and that is the being who created it. All property is created. All property is a thing of value or has value. We cannot separate until the only things of value we have were created by us or exchanged for something of equal value. It is by not having anything that is not owned directly by us, without any other claims, that we separate from the other world. For the other world is a world in which ownership is in contention. The other world is a place where there are liabilities attached to everything of value. The 10 great evils are simply a symptom of these liabilities. To end the 10 great evils, stop producing social costs, stop generating liabilities.